Okay, so welcome to the BDO series in terms of our global risk landscape report. This is the first of a number of sessions. I've got myself, Sean Pascoe, partner at Risk Advisory, and Georgia Perks, a senior consultant in Risk Advisory, with me.
Hello.
So we thought we might just go through and decipher the report, and I suppose if there's going to be any questions, we're probably going to be answering them after the session, but feel free to submit any questions that you have. We thought this session might be good just to go through and break down key elements of the report. We'll probably be going over and regurgitating some elements of it, but our hope is to make it a bit clearer. And in the future series, we're going to have Janine Waters talking about the people side. We're going to have Shane Swift talking about the technology side, and Adam from a regulatory and forensics perspective. So in terms of looking towards the 2018 landscape, BDO, we actually undertake a risk landscape report on a yearly basis. It's gathered from insights from around from 500 business executives across 55 countries, and covers a range of sectors on their perceptions of risk in both the present and the future as well. I think it's important then to look from a recap from last year. So in 2017, the top 3 risk areas were regulation, economic slowdown, and competition. Now, it could be argued that these are more challenges rather than risks, but I'm sure there are risks within those areas. Regulation is actually an interesting one, because you can see with a changing environment, particularly in Australia just recently, you can see that a lot of these risks that were basically in 2017 are starting to land. One of those will be the GDPR and data privacy, and the impact in terms of that's having in Australia. And interestingly, when I was over in Europe last year, they were actually quite amazed at how light Australia was having it with regards to regulatory impacts. But I think that just like the fashion trends that come out from Europe 6 to 12 months later, we're seeing the same thing in terms of regulation. And I think you'll also see that the Royal Commission into the banking area, the Royal Commission into healthcare, into aged care, and I suppose a stronger focus on corporate governance. You'll see a lot more of that coming out over due course. And in terms of the Royal Commissions, it'll be interesting to see what regulations and I suppose rules and processes get put in place around that. In terms of economic slowdown, always going to be a challenge. There's always going to be ebbs and flows, going from bear markets to bull markets. And in terms of competition, again, that's always going to exist, but I think there's going to be a need for businesses to look at how they're going to reinvent or change their operating models as technologies and customer demands change and evolve over time. And I think that's probably the essence of the 2018 report, which is really about how businesses need to tackle some of those challenges if they're going to survive. Just finishing off in terms of 2017, some of the specific risks that I did see that came out were around cyber, and we're seeing that continuing today. Disruptive technologies, and I've mentioned that Shane Swift will be doing a future session around that, and of course on reputation risk. I think again that's going to be a continued focus going forward. And if you look back to the events that occurred around 2017 or in the lead up, you had Brexit, you had Trump coming in as president, you had the One Belt initiative through China, and of course we had continued Middle East tensions and issues going on there. So you can see how a lot of that was impacting at the time, and we're probably flowing on into that impact now into 2018. So if we look at the 2018 report, and if we break down in terms of what the gist of it is, it's really around innovation and agility, and the businesses need to adopt or incorporate those elements. And if you look at the diagram in front of you, you've got the green boxes, the 4 boxes there, and they're really looking at the internal forces that need to be managed and considered by the business in terms of being able to be agile and to demonstrate innovation, because the key thing that they're trying to do, or will need to do, is become more customer centric. Now in doing that, you can see that on the outside, the blue boxes is around some of the forces that are external to the organization that are going to have impacts on the ability to be able to be agile and innovate and to get to the outcomes that businesses need to achieve. And in doing that, if a business is agile and has the ability to innovate and be customer centric, they're going to be in a much better position to navigate around those external forces. So in terms of future proofing, that's probably one of the core focuses of the actual of the report this year. And to future proof, you need to be able to look at how you're currently doing your operations. And if you look at it from the point of view that the report breaks down businesses into two types. You've got your operators and you've got your innovators. The innovators obviously are the ones that are going to be more agile, are going to embrace change, and they're going to be looking to change the business models that they have, where the operators are more focused internally on their current processes, and they're probably more product or service focused than what a lot of the innovators are. Okay, so if you look at the characteristics of innovators versus the operators, you can see that there's quite a gap there, and you can look at it from the point of view that one's more of a future alternative type where we need to be, the other is where we are at the moment. And the report's pretty well highlighting from all the respondees that businesses to survive and to stay relevant need to actually look at becoming innovators and look to how to manage those external forces that might actually inhibit their ability to innovate, which is often linked back to a traditional conservative type of management approach. So here we have innovators. So obviously we've got higher performance type companies that generate higher profits. They have a higher appetite for agility and to change. They've got a high future proofing because of the way their business models operate and their ability to adapt within the external environment. Often have technology-led transformations because technology is going to be the driver, the enabler. Again, use of technology to manage risk better. Alternative models, you've got probably going to have more of an outsourced infrastructure rather than carrying their own IT infrastructure in place. They're going to be seen as the leaders in the market, so generally they're not going to be too worried about competition because they are going to be the competition for other players. And of course they're going to be having a high ability to adapt to blindside risks, which we'll cover a bit later in this session, but they're the risks that basically they can't really plan for, and therefore they need to be agile and be able to navigate that market, those risks clearly. And of course they're going to find that the macro risks are their greatest challenge, which are external forces like tariffs or global trade, versus internal risks, which is more probably going to be product development focused and those areas. Looking at the operators, of course, they're the ones that generally have lower performance, or will see to be having lower performance. They're going to have a high level of competition. In fact, their focus will probably be on their competitors rather than being the competitor. They're going to be reactionary to the market. So they're going along in a market where they're not able to predict. They're actually reacting to legislation or things that come through. They're going to have traditional, or what we call passive business models, where it's there's a historical element to it and what they've been doing. They're going to have low agility and appetite to change, and of course they're going to have probably a highly embedded physical infrastructure in place where they're managing, if not all their IT, large components of it, and then that's going to be quite hard and robust, less robust to be able to move away from those. Of course, people will be managing risks rather than systems. They won't be embedded necessarily in their processes. They'll have teams doing that. And we mentioned before, they're going to be more inward focusing in terms of that. So a key message that came out of the report was that times are changing and passive responses will no longer be good enough.
So the report asked our respondees what was more important to them in terms of ensuring innovation or operational effectiveness in ensuring business success. So we saw that 47% of our respondees thought that operational effectiveness and innovation were equally important, which was quite interesting because that's obviously nearly 50%. But then in terms of those that saw one more important than the other, the majority saw operational effectiveness as more important than innovation in ensuring businesses' success. And that aligns to the maturity of a business, the dichotomy between the two. So we see that startups are more agile, so they're more able to innovate and be more creative with their functional business models or products. And big businesses are still operating their traditional business models and are using these startups to move towards agility and innovation. So the example we've got here is Shazam, which is the music identification app. So that was just purchased by Apple, and Apple being the big business that has a tried and tested operating model, and Shazam being the small startup that was trying to be more innovative but could never really figure out how to become a big blazing business. So yeah, we've got the dichotomy between the two and what's more important for ensuring a business's success.
Okay, and what you're going to find too, I suppose, with this is that a lot of traditional businesses are tending to use startups to guide, their innovation side, because they probably find that their existing models and frameworks are very difficult to be able to achieve that. So you're going to find that they're going to more and more, they're going to be looking at what can we do quickly using a startup, what are we going to get best bang for our buck, how do we actually turn this into a sustainable business model, how do we use that to transform our business into one that's more agile and is more innovative. And you can understand the challenges over time, because just looking at technologies, if they're very technology resourced and they're actually managing that, then they're going to be constrained by their own, I suppose, history of having chose and invested in those technologies. So there could be a few years of transition. So while the leadership team might be very supportive of that, they may actually have their own inhibitors internally in achieving that.
And it does take time to prove the business model, commit to it for a fixed period, and then prove its success. So that takes time and resources as well.
Okay, so then we come to risk management, I suppose, and how it supports agility and innovation. So the report highlights, questions are rightly being raised around businesses seen as highly innovative but less open to the norms of corporate governance. And this indicates that there's a need for the right levels of control oversight being in place without actually these being an inhibitor. So if we go to the next slide, you can see how risk taking is fundamental to the success of a business, right? And they can't seek to eliminate risk. And this is one of the findings I'm finding in a lot of companies I'm doing work with, is that the nature of how they do risk management is actually quite traditional, and it focuses on the negative. And the negative often has a tendency to want to take away or manage the risk down to a very low level. And of course, where there's no risk, obviously there's no reward. So it's coming back to making sure that the business itself, its culture, its values, are all aligned, and that the risk management actually supports that. So as I said before, we don't want to see it as an inhibitor to agility and innovation, but it needs to be managed carefully as well, because you can't just open the door and let risk just run riot and innovate around innovation. You need to make sure that there's appropriate controls in place, and getting that balance is actually often very hard. So we are seeing people from different backgrounds coming into risk management, which is great. I think it's actually a fantastic thing. The only thing we want to do is make sure that they're looking to manage the risk and drive the opportunities from that, rather than to close it down. And I am seeing a lot of people with legal backgrounds coming in, and their mindset's always around protection. So I need to protect the business, need to protect this. And often that then can be a little bit over the top in terms of how they actually manage the risks, and they try to transfer it through legal means, or they try and close it down by stopping that kind of operation, which then of course can lead to innovation and agility being lost. So while I think it's great we have people from different backgrounds doing risk management, they need to be able to line back to the I suppose the values and the culture of the organization, and look at risk from a positive point of view rather than negative.
Oh, so and there was also a quote in there about innovation involving risk, as you mentioned before, and that senior management is going to see short-term decreases in performance as the business first adapts. So they need to be prepared for that as well.
That's right. Okay, that's good. So next slide, we're talking about risk management, innovation, and agility. So what do we need to do? I mean, you look at it very carefully. You know, everyone generally has a strategic plan, right? But one of the things is it innovative, or is it following the traditional model that just almost outlines a work or operating plan rather than a strategic plan? And I think that strategic plan, in terms of being innovative, needs to be embraced by senior management. And through the report, and it was quite repetitive, but I think it was trying to reinforce the message that senior management can actually be that impediment if it's not managed carefully. And then Janine will probably be covering in her session around the people side, you know, and the capability and the capacity of businesses to be able to look at change, look at embracing and becoming innovative and agile. Now, the risk management framework needs to support the innovation and agility. And when you know, having that, and I think I've stressed it in the previous slides, you need to have the right people. They need to be realistic, they need to be optimistic, but of course they need to have that sense of, you know, control and oversight and make sure that things are not necessarily running right, but they need to be open to new ideas. So, you know, there is to design and manage the ability to achieve the strategic plan. So when you have the strategic plan in place, you're identifying the risks that will, you know, inhibit you achieving that, but also risks from an upside that will enable you to achieve it as well. In doing that, you would need to break it down, you know, per our risk management framework, where you do root cause analysis, and this would identify the controls, the strategies, and even potentially the gaps. And hopefully those gaps are actually identifying elements of innovation and agility that are not necessarily, you know, in place at that time. And of course, you would need then to have appropriate action around follow-up, monitoring of progress, and feedback mechanisms from customers and internal stakeholders that are now enable you to enhance your business model and to deliver innovation through agility. Because at the end of the day, we know it's going to be around stakeholders and having a customer-centric approach that's going to lead to the success of a lot of businesses. Okay, so often we find within organisations that are trying to innovate that there's a disconnect internally. You might have the front office that are front operations that are very innovative, but then goes through a funnel back to a back office that's very conservative. So one of the things that we need to look at is how do we structure a business in such a way that enables that, you know, I suppose everyone to be aligned in terms of, per the previous slides, on the values, the culture, and the strategic plan of the organisation. So you want to make sure that, you know, agility and innovation are actually coming through in the decisions that are being made by senior management. And this, again, as before, needs to be supported by the risk management framework, and looking to make sure that there's no bottlenecks in place that could actually stop that, or that any operating or business models in place are actually effective in terms of, you know, enabling that to happen as well. So in terms of moving from an operational focus to an innovative and agile business, we mentioned before that you need an innovative strategy. You also need to have leadership to embrace the change. You need to identify and recruit the right people in delivering the strategy. You need to have the right risk management framework aligned to that strategy. You need to undertake digital transformation, and of course, all of that would tend to drive a customer-centric type approach. So in terms of the digital strategy, again, I mentioned at the start that Shane Swift will be looking at technology and digital disruption from a risk perspective in one of the upcoming series. But the report itself highlights that new technologies are being introduced, you know, from 3D printing to distributed systems, that alter the IT infrastructure requirements in order to support different, you know, ways of working. So, you know, cloud drives are open. So cloud is open, and drives approaches new ways of working. It represents new challenges, particularly if to old operating models. So you can see I said before about the innovators versus the operators. Majority of the innovators are actually using cloud, and they're actually not having to worry too much about that, maintain that environment. They're more looking about how they can utilize that environment, you know, much better.
So here we talk about the future proofing of your business with technology. So we looked at our respondees, and the majority of them have a strategy for future proofing in development, and that's aligned to a strategy for upgrading technological capability as well. So if your business isn't future-proofed or doesn't have a future-proofing strategy, it's just got a passive strategy and it's not going to achieve long-term success. So we want to be up in the future-proofed area where 28% of our respondees are sitting, and they've got an investment in technology, the right technology to ensure long-term success. And that doesn't just mean a change in one system, it's a whole digital transformation. That's really going to help with the pace of change in the risk and technological landscape, which is currently catching business leaders off guard and threatening their existence. So yeah, it's really about future-proofing for long-term survival from a digital perspective.
And one of the things that came out in the report too was that there's an additional challenge around making sure that the board and the boardroom is aligned to that as well, because again, we talked about senior management before, but you've also got the board, and if the board's more of a traditional type focus business, then they're going to struggle with understanding what the requirements for innovation and agility are. In fact, they might even see them as being, uncontrolled in some respects as well.
And a lot of the reviews that we do for clients, we come in and look at a system, and we see that a client has replaced a system and they've missed that opportunity to innovate and focus on the future, and they've just looked at the short-term needs rather than the long-term.
Yeah, and basically what we find that they're replacing like with like.
Yeah.
And so they're not actually really taking advantage of that time to look at the strategy for the future and where they need to be.
Yeah.
Good point. Okay. So squeezing redundant systems and unused capacity may improve efficiency, but often reduces the capacity to cope with shock. So sort of, aligns with what we just said before about, how, organizations use their technology and look at the way they're going to go forward. But looking from the top barriers to successful innovation, unsurprisingly, internal governance and bureaucracy were identified as being the top, I suppose, barrier, closely followed by inadequate or outdated technology. And you can see the fact that they're worried about technology shows that they're in that operational mind rather than innovation perspective. Funding obviously was then third in that list, short-term performance targets and a risk-averse leadership. So sort of supports what we've just set up to date in terms of some of those barriers. We also talked about the fact that frontline staff can be innovative, but senior management can often be the obstacle, which links back to that risk-averse leadership point there. So again, we look at that within our clients, we're witnessing inadequate, outdated technology. We mentioned before, like for like. A lot of clients become very process-driven, and they don't stop to think about, the systems or what they need in terms of going forward. And we've witnessed a lot of clients losing a lot of money because they can't either capture the data or extract it to be able to use for decision making. So, a culture for success. And again, I mentioned before that Janine Waters will be talking about the people, the change, the capability and the capacity side of risk and the global risk landscape report. But it's interesting that the report highlights that complacency has no place in a successful business. Business policies need to reflect zero tolerance for anyone that cannot step up to meet the new challenges. The right attitude and policy should provide every opportunity for employees to demonstrate the can-do attitude, and they receive proper training to nurture and grow and develop in this. So you can't just get there and go, well, because you're zero tolerance, you're not good enough. You need to make sure that processes are put in place to enable that and to support that. So a key element in this is going to be around the organisation and the organisation's DNA.
So in the report, there was a big focus on culture and the organisation's putting innovation into the organisation's DNA. So a few of the items we highlighted was that the organisation needs to be open to change, sharing ideas and feedback. And a good example of this, which was highlighted in the report, was high street retailers. So physical retailers, their business was completely disrupted by e-retailers, and they've had to move a lot of their products online at the same time keeping their physical stores. So having both, but making sure they're open to change and having the feedback from the customer. There was also confidence, trust, leadership and support. that goes throughout the report, the support of senior management in innovation and agility, but also the strategy might allow for innovation and agility, but it has to really come from the top. We see a lot of our clients use language that inhibits this innovation, saying we tried that in 2014 and it didn't work, and it needs to be a more open, communicative and transparent way of speaking and communicating. And so we've also got collaboration with cross-functional teams, long-term focus and working towards common goals, and diversity of thought and experience and skill. And they all need to be within the culture of the organisation to allow for that innovation. And so our respondees also agreed about the importance of culture in engaging the organisation in innovation. So our respondees highlighted their top 6 ingredients for innovation, and 4 of these were aligned to culture and people. So the top one was 77% of respondees thought that the most important ingredient for innovation was a culture to foster and support innovation. And that makes sense, but it was just interesting that 3 of these, so culture to foster and support innovation, access to the right people, and capacity and capability for creativity, those both came before access to funding and relevant technology, which are probably more traditional ingredients.
Yeah, it's quite interesting that, because you look at it from that point of view, there's a really strong emphasis around the people side, which Janine will cover in her session in a couple of weeks' time. And you look at the Royal Commissions that are going on, and you can see a lot of the findings are around the capacity and the capability and the practices of people in those organisations. So you can see there's a strong emphasis on those elements going forward as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so blindside risk. So the report highlighted that innovation is the capacity to react to evolutionary pressures. The actual reaction is determined by its agility. Risks that cannot be predicted cannot be prepared for. The only capacity a business can use to respond to blindside risk is its ability to change the way it operates at speed. So basically it's agility. So importantly, businesses need to be agile, innovative, be open to change, and open to alternative business models. And so when we look at blindside risk, we're really looking at the risks as indicated that they may not be aware of, or they may not be able to control at that point in time, and they need to be able to adapt to be able to do that. So if we look at the next slide, and we've got the top 10 blindside risks that were identified. Again, probably no surprises there from that perspective, but it does highlight the challenges that businesses are going to have around managing these types of risks. So you look at regulatory, for example, we know, as I said before, issues coming out of Europe, we're going to have to be looking at how do we actually maintain those. Government is always very strong that if there's any uncertainty about a certain area, they always put laws or rules or regulations in place around that, and they can be sometimes sensible and sometimes questionable. Look at the other main blind sides there around supply chain, macroeconomic developments. A lot of those are driven by global events. I mentioned before, like the Trump factor. You've also got with China the One Belt initiative, and then of course the looming trade war, between the US and China. All those elements can actually have a flow-on impact across businesses that are very hard to plan for, because you don't know what exactly the outcome is going to be, and potentially could even be an upside. Who knows for Australia? So we're looking at these. You're looking at medium to low performing businesses. Their focus obviously is around increasing competition, because they're caught in that competition type mode. Supply chain is also big, and also the effects from Brexit are important risks for them. So if businesses are facing a hostile environment, their key advantage will be how they respond within that environment to effectively, I suppose, manage or better manage competition without actually increasing their costs significantly, because that's going to be an inhibitor in terms of their business. And it further reinforces the need for businesses to be agile, open to change, and to be innovative, because in the day, their new operating models and how they embrace these changes is going to be a strong, I suppose, case for how they're going to future-proof themselves against these blindside risks. And those that can do it well and be adaptable will find that they're going to survive. Those that don't may find that, in essence, they're going to go backwards. Okay, so in terms of the number one blindside risk by level of future-proofing, it was quite interesting because those that believed that they were future-proofed felt that, 66% of those that were future-proof found that regulatory risk was their main concern from a blindside perspective. Those that had no plan in place and a plan in place, funny enough, still had increased competition as one of their key blindside risks. So it does ask a question of those that have got a plan in place, whether they felt that plan was effective, given that the increased competition is more of a blindside risk for a process-orientated business rather than an innovator, which is why when we see the plan in progress, future-proofing in progress and future-proofed, having much more focus on regulatory and macroeconomics, external factors rather than the internal ones. Yeah, okay. So in looking at the number one blindside risks by sector, you can see here that from a geopolitical point of view, financial services and private equity found that was with the most highest blindside risk by the sector. From new energy, healthcare, manufacturing, natural resources, found environmental to be the biggest one. Regulatory risk for leisure and hospitality, professional services, TMT. I actually am surprised by that result because in Australia, from our perspective, I would think, given the Royal Commissions and the various things going on at the moment, and in my experience, the industries that have the highest regulatory impacts, and maybe they can adjust for it better, which is why it hasn't come up, will be education, financial services, and healthcare. So I suspect this is saying that because these guys are not necessarily caught up with the regulatory risk at the moment, they're probably not necessarily prepared for future impacts.
And Sean, maybe that relates back to the lag that we see maybe in 6 to 8 months, these industries will be looking towards regulatory risk more than they are now in Australia.
Exactly. And as I said before, it's like a fashion statement. So it's rolling out from Europe. We may be copying the tail end or the beginning end of it coming through here as well. And of course, in the real estate and construction industry, increased competition was their number one blindside risk. And in wholesale and retail supply chain was number one blindside risk. So you can see how their strategies would need to be focused on ensuring that they're actually able to navigate around those type of risks coming through. Okay, so innovating within a global and competitive market. So the report highlights the pace of change has caught many business leaders by surprise, threatening their very existence. The passive behaviour will not be good enough during these changing times. So pretty well emphasise again what we've said before in terms of, you can't go with the traditional model. You need to look at how you're actually planning yourself. So in the report itself, it actually asks business leaders to reflect on their organisation and look at their business from a point of view of how mature is its appetite for innovation. So there's a number of questions there that you can see that it'd be worthwhile for you to ask or to be looking at from your own entity or your client's perspective. If they are looking at innovation and have they got the appetite for it, do they understand what it really is and what the potentials are? Is it agile in terms of being able to adapt? Does it have the resources and the right resources around that? And can it manage that, in terms of a new business model coming in? Because you can almost see there's going to be some level of disruption and probably learning and adapting to that environment. So the thing is pretty obvious in terms of you take a strategic focus rather than a tactical focus. That's what the innovators are pretty well doing. So they're looking at where they want to be and what they need to do. And the benefits of being agile, of course, there's going to be improved customer satisfaction and retention. There's going to be a competitive differentiator As I said before, those that innovate will probably be the competitor that everyone's looking out and watching out for. It'll be faster product delivery, ability to act on new opportunities a lot faster in terms of speed, greater process and cost efficiencies, and a greater employee productivity as well. So innovation is required. It's a basic ingredient for corporate success. And if you look at here in terms of the upside, so the positive impacts of innovation, so those businesses that had no current strategy for future-proofing felt that market expansion, penetration, and cost process efficiencies would give them the two biggest impacts in terms of if they were innovating or demonstrating innovation. Those that had a strategy for future-proofing in development felt that cost process efficiency, so same as before, and competitive relevance would have the biggest upside for them. Those where future-proofing was actually in process could, thought that the customer centricity and cost process efficiencies would have the biggest upside for them in terms of as they're moving through that spectrum. And then those that were actually believe themselves to be future-proof, their biggest upside is continuing on the customer-centric approach and looking at in terms of maintaining their competitive relevance. As I mentioned before, in terms of being the leader in that market. Okay. So embracing the new power of the customer. So I think one of the key messages come out very clearly is the customer is now the change agent for businesses. So no longer can we just get there and produce a product or deliver a service. We need to make sure that that's going to meet what the customer needs in terms of delivering, because that's going to drive then the value chain for that business. So the new marketplace is global, it's transparent, and basically it's direct. There's no more hoarding or storing inventory. It's all around just in time. It's all about knowing where the goods are. I'm sure we've all ordered goods online. We've been given a tracking number, and we've all got on there and we've seen where it is, and it's between the warehouse, it's on the truck, and it's halfway there. So we get a better sense of that, and I think that transparency makes people more comfortable and probably show more loyalty towards those type of businesses. So the effect of the marketplace is that it has three effects on competition. It builds the capacity to interact with the customer on their own terms. I think it's critical, and I just mentioned that before, that they're in control, they have the power, and the businesses need to be aware of their clients and the competition. So what are they offering? Are we still relevant? And there needs to be fast reaction in terms of getting services or the products to the customer, and not getting there and saying estimated delivery date is 2 weeks. It could be estimated delivery date is 2 days. So the future belongs to businesses that embrace the power of the customer, and the customer is, in my view, the change agent for businesses going forward.
I think what's interesting here is how quickly this arose. So customers have so much access to information, and that was really a recent thing. Yeah. Happened really quickly. So companies need to be agile in responding to that and figuring out how they're going to respond.
Okay, so in terms of low-performing businesses, and we mentioned about they're being blindsided by global and customer-centric markets, right? So if you look at it from here, 100% of low-performing businesses are unprepared for increased competition, and that's demonstrated by their models in terms of the ability to react to an innovator. An innovator they'd struggle against those. 85% of low-performing businesses are failing to innovate to meet the customer needs. So you can see a strong link there again in terms of their ability to adjust to the market versus, say, an innovator in that capacity. Where if we go to the next slide, then we've got high-performing businesses. So 100% of high-performing businesses have a greater appetite, an appetite for greater agility, and 91% have elevated innovation on the boardroom agenda. So you can see the differences between the low-performing and the high-performing, which then comes back to that, how they set their strategy. Is it innovative? Are they looking forward? Are they looking sideways or backwards in some cases?
And here there's just an obvious divide opening up between those businesses that are embracing change and actively engaging in it, and those that are being forced to change with like pressures from the market. So that gap is increasingly obvious when innovation levels are correlated with commercial success, so between the high and the low performing businesses.
Okay, so we've come to the end of this session. So the purpose of this webinar was to go through the 2018 global risk landscape. I mentioned before that there will be future series on this. So Georgia and myself have covered off on today the risk landscape. Shane and Ryan will be covering off the digital strategy and risk in terms of technology, disruptive technologies, elements of cyber and the future. Adam will be covering off from a forensics regulatory point of view on the 25th, and Janine and Vanessa will be covering off on people advisory and the people to change capability capacity side in early November. So I hope you found this webinar to be useful, and we look forward to you attending the future ones coming up. Thank you.
Thank you.